Let's welcome Dr. Thomas Lovejoy, President of the Amazon Biodiversity Center, Senior Fellow at the United Nations Foundation, Professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy, George Mason University, Washington, D.C.
I'm Tom Lovejoy, and I've just been fascinated with the variety of life since I was about 14. Um, in any case, I once was about to give a talk, sort of like this one, and I was introduced as the father of biological diversity, and and I said, no, 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 that's not biologically possible. Uh, and that's where somebody came up with the godfather of biodiversity. So that's how it happened, and I'm that's it for life. I've had the great joy of exploring life on Earth throughout my career, uh, and doing what I can to help its conservation. And I think one of the really important aspects of that, which has emerged pretty strongly in the last decade, is how the food and land use trajectory in the world actually interacts with the remaining biodiversity on the planet. And just to start with, there are 3 times more people than when I was born. And each one of those deserves a reasonable quality of life. So the issue then becomes how to define that quality of life in a way that does not essentially pull the biological rug out from under our future. And also be creative and innovative in trying to find ways to meet basic human needs and aspirations with much less impact on the natural world. So there are scientists who've actually calculated how you can feed all those people an adequate and reasonable diet without destroying another square inch of nature. That means in some places enhancing the productivity of the land. In other instances, it's eliminating food waste. In some parts of the world, the food that never gets to market. In others, like the United States and a lot of advanced countries, the food that actually never gets eaten because it's sat in our refrigerators too long, or because restaurant rules don't allow for some food to be used once the day is over. And there's also an element there of, what kind of diet we actually pursue. And I would just say, this is not a sermon to completely avoid eating meat. What it is a sermon to listen to our doctors who are telling us to be much more careful about the things we eat. So one of the really interesting things is there are some very credible scientists who looked at this challenge of how we feed the current billions and the billions to come, and do it without destroying another square inch of nature. And they've actually sort of brought that down to real numbers that involve the things I was just referring to in terms of change of diet, improving the efficiency of agriculture, eliminating waste. And within all of that, there should be a way forward with plenty of room for the surviving biodiversity on the planet. And indeed, because there's so much degraded agricultural land, if that land is restored, you can get a lot more productivity either as biodiverse ecosystems or as important contributions to agriculture. So most people are unaware, but there literally were 3 conventions that came into existence at the Earth Summit in 1992. Everybody knows about the Climate Change Convention. Some people are aware of the Biodiversity Convention, and certainly everybody involved in this will be aware of that. And the third one, which is essentially a convention to combat desertification, is one that really people are mostly unaware of, but it is an important part of addressing the challenge of what we're talking about. So there are major efforts going on right now to have really ambitious conservation targets. When the Convention on Biological Diversity meets in China, I think that's later this year, is currently scheduled, including the idea of 30% of the land in every country being devoted to conservation and 30% of the coastal waters being devoted to conservation. And that seems to be gathering some encouraging momentum. You know, there will be problems for certain countries that basically don't have 30% of their land area available to turn into national parks. India is one of those countries. So in that case, you have to be creative and try and figure out ways that nature can prosper while humans are also getting some uses from the landscape. So the good news here is, as close as we've come, most of the biodiversity on the planet is still with us. A lot of it hovering on the brink. But if we act promptly in 2021 and 2022, we can actually rescue a large portion of that before each of those lines of evolution of close to 4 billion years comes to an end. So that's the challenge, and that's the opportunity. And in particular, you know, one of the things that has been problematical in terms of conserving biological diversity are human pesticides and fertilizers. There tends to be a major overuse and wasteful use of fertilizers, which end up creating ultimately dead zones in coastal waters, like the one off the coast of the mouth of the Mississippi. So the number of these so-called dead zones internationally has been doubling every decade for the last 3 or 4 decades. So we need to get a handle on that. And another is to deal with pesticides. most of which are molecules which are novel to nature, created in a laboratory, and then interfere with the biological systems of particular species and very often many other species other than the target species. So wouldn't it be nice if we could give up those artificial pesticides and find natural pesticides that we could use in their place, pesticides which would naturally degrade. And that's where the extraordinary biological diversity of this planet can play a very special and useful role, along with the myriad of others that it does for us on a daily basis. So, I work a lot in the Amazon. I've been going there since 1965. And for the last 41 years in particular, I've been working in some forests north of Manaus in the central Amazon. And there's always wonderful things to show people who come to visit. And inevitably, one of the things one shows are leaf-cutting ants. And leaf-cutting ants are the most highly evolved social insects, period. They have more castes than any other social insect. And when you see them, they're usually wandering in lines headed towards the entrance to the nest. Each of the ants bearing pieces of leaves that they have cut apart. And all those leaves go down into the nest. And there they become mulch for the ants' fungus farm. So basically, they're all about running a gigantic fungus farm underground. So these forests in which they are operating have hundreds and hundreds of tree species in them. But clearly, the ants very carefully have learned over time which ones have natural fungicides in their leaves, and they don't take those underground because that would be a failed experiment. So if one is looking for natural fungicides, what a great way to figure out which trees to look at by figuring out which trees the army ants leave alone, as opposed to which ones they can literally almost defoliate overnight. So that's part of the wonder of the variety of life on Earth. It's really a matter of thinking about all these species we share the planet with, all of them having existence as species which are like 3.7 to 4.0 billion years in time. So anytime we actually eliminate a species, we're eliminating an incredible pedigree. And I, for one, think that there's very little justification to ever doing something like that. But in the course of all those incredible evolutionary millennia, each of those species has been on a daily basis solving a bunch of biological problems which are particular to it. And they're not only doing that on a daily basis, they're accumulating them over time. So basically, the biological diversity of the planet is a gigantic library of solutions to particular sets of problems that particular species have. New ones being invented on a daily basis. And any one of those can reveal some new insight into biological science that could be of huge benefit to us, like finding a new naturally degradable pesticide. So my favorite example, again from the Amazon, is a pretty big and very nasty snake called the fer-de-lance. And it has very effective venom, which causes its prey or its enemy to have their blood pressure go to zero permanently. So you might ask, well, what's the value of that in the world? So there were scientists based at Brazil's Venom Institute in Sao Paulo, the Butantan Institute, who became quite intrigued by what the fer-de-lance venom actually does, and were able to identify a system of regulation of blood pressure in mammals that had hitherto been totally unknown. It's called the angiotensin system. And that's what its venom works on, and it causes the blood pressure to go to zero forever. So what value might that be? Well, pharmaceutical chemists from the Squibb company in this instance were able to devise a molecule which plays on that angiotensin system. And that produced the first of what are called the ACE inhibitors, which literally hundreds of millions of people around the world, easily a billion, use on a daily basis to control their high blood pressure. And I assure you that when most of them go to the pharmacy to get their ACE inhibitor, they don't have a clue that they're benefiting from the biology of a nasty snake in the faraway Amazon. So that's part of how we benefit from the natural world, but have yet to devise any good way to keep track of it and therefore appreciate it. So some of the new things advancing to help conservation are actually looking at ways for countries to keep track of all of this, at least in a very broad brush way, by natural resource national accounts, so they know whether they're running down their natural resource base or not. So I think as we look ahead to the coming years and decades, which will be the moment of truth in terms of how we deal with the rest of life on Earth, that recognizing the power of biological systems to transform our own existence, and to recognize how all of that contributes to our economies. If that can get brought into how we actually account for how we do things at the national level, it will be a much better future for humans and for the rest of life on Earth.